Good evening. I'm Rudy Dean of the School of Architecture. Thank you for joining us tonight to launch the Tecnoglass series for the Spring 2026 edition. First, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Tecnoglass, for supporting us now for the 10th year. This is indeed the 10th year anniversary of the series. And on that occasion, in order to celebrate that milestone, we have a special theme for the series. We usually like to curate the lectures, have some kind of focus. The last one was on affordable housing. This term, we are, in order to celebrate that anniversary, we are doing a retrospective of sort. We are revisiting this last decade of lectures and uh, re-inviting our favorites, the greatest of the great for a reprise of their performance here. They will show us new work, but also comment on the arc, the trajectory of their uh, work and practice. So this is why we are calling it mixtape. It's like a kind of best of compilation. The lecture will be followed by an informal conversation interview tonight with myself or for the following lectures with other faculty members. And to continue a tradition we started last term, the students introduce the speaker. Uh, so I'm going to invite now Adia Simone to come here to the podium to introduce our speaker tonight.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Adia Simone, and I am a first-year master's student here at the University of Miami. It is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Tecnoglass lecture series and to introduce our guest speaker, Michael Maltzan, founder of MMA, a Los Angeles-based architecture and urban design practice. The topic of focus is entitled Scales of the City, the place of lively complexities and of connections. Mr. Maltzan projects cross a wide range of typologies, from cultural institutions to city infrastructure, which include Moody Center for the Arts at Rice University, MoMA Queens, Star Apartments, and the new Sixth Street Viaduct, just to name a few. His path to architecture wasn't conventional. A childhood dream of becoming an astronaut, short-lived after realizing he was actually claustrophobic. Moving with his family from New York to Ohio to Connecticut sharpened his awareness of places. At a technical college, he began studying building technology, working with wood and other building materials prior to attending Rhode Island School of Design. A graduate of Rhode Island School of Design, where he earned both a BFA and a B.Arch, and subsequently graduating from Harvard University, Graduate School of Design with an M.Arch degree. Mr. Maltzan has garnered numerous accolades. He's a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and received the 2016 AIA Los Angeles Gold Medal. He's a recipient of the 2012 American Academy of the Arts and Letters Architecture Award and was inducted as a member of the Academy in 2023. Currently, he serves on the Dean's Leadership Council at Harvard Graduate School of Design and a visiting committee to the GSD, just to name a few. Mr. Maltzan's work has gained international acclaim for innovation in both design and construction. The firm and its projects have been widely featured in national and international publications and have been exhibited in museums worldwide. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Michael Maltzan.
Thank you again for the introduction, Rudy. Thank you for inviting me, the school inviting me. It's a really interesting series. A number of people who are part of this series are friends and colleagues, and I'm as interested as anybody to see what they might present. I just want to move one thing here. Great. I also appreciate being back here. I forget when it was that I lectured. It's got to be one of the most iconic, unusual lecture halls that I have lectured in. So it's fun being back here. I'm fascinated and very much motivated by the forms and also the idea of the city. It is a place of lively complexities, but especially a place of connections. There's also long histories in cities that are much less positive, and that point is even more apparent in our contemporary moment when we're battling increased polarization, siloization of communities and disconnection socially. What role does architecture have in the city to address these challenges? For me, the primary laboratory to explore this question has been Los Angeles. Hardly a city in many people's minds when you think about the term city, but a place where it forces one, I think, to confront many of the issues of the contemporary city, like the possibility of many different scales existing within its vastness, or unusual and unlikely adjacencies of programs, uses, and landscapes. This is a photograph from a collaborator, Ewan Bond, from a book I did, No More Play. And also a city where the lines, or let's say the seams that spatialize the separations and hard adjacencies of typically incompatible uses and economies exist and define the city. And of course, a significant originating texture of the sprawling contemporary city form in places like LA was the post-war suburb, a place that has been long criticized, not always unjustly, but also a place where I grew up, in my case, in the post-war suburb of Levittown, and where many qualities often associated with the traditional city, like affordability and community, actually did in fact exist. At the very center of all of that is the form of the house. I was talking with a group a little bit earlier today about the architect Yonah Friedman, who in his book Pro Domo wrote, "When I was a schoolboy, I discovered that a house alone does not exist, that it does not end at the outer limits of the ground floor, but continues on to the streets, the garden, then to the house across the street. The house across the street itself continues into what is in front of it, and so forth. To imagine one house is to imagine the whole world." That quote has, over the years, really affected me and my work in its blurring of the scale of the house in the city, that the architecture of the house can be seen as a kind of microcosm of the city itself. So that's where I'd like to start the talk with a house. About 10 years ago, we completed a house for two painters, Larry Pittman and Roy Dowell, the Pittman Dowell Residence. In La Crescenta, it's really at the edge in Los Angeles of this sprawl of single-family houses, and at this line, this interface, this friction with the mountains and nature beyond. Those two places are really, in many ways, in deep contrast, and we've seen that with the most recent fires in the city. The site has a house by the modernist Richard Neutra that has existed since the 50s. And our house is just adjacent to that. So in many ways, I had thought of those houses as kind of alter egos of each other. The Neutra house, called the Cyrulnik House, is really a quintessentially modernist, I'd say even romantic modernist house, all about transparency, highly exposed. The clients, though, that Larry and Roy thought that it didn't really represent the realities of their contemporary life. They lead very public lives in their teaching and their exhibitions. And in a sense, the house was too exposed for them. The new house was meant to be a kind of inversion with a much more opaque exterior and a more transparent interior. It sits really between the entry point to the site down below the house and the Neutra above. It spirals up, and the house form is 7 sides, different than this one, but still geometrically related, with the idea that 7 sides is something you can't ever quite locate the center of. It always seems to be in movement or in motion. Because Neutra was looking down on the house, I thought very much of the roof of the house as the facade of the house describing the internal life inside. The plan is on the right-hand side, the structural diagram's on the left. That internal life, where rooms and spaces don't have doors, they're placed in direct contact with each other, whether it's bedroom, bathroom, living room, kitchen, was really an exploration of an idea of simultaneity, that because of our lives, because we're connected to our devices at all times, that in many ways we're in all spaces at all the time. And if modernism had transparency in the dissolution of those spaces between inside and outside, I'd say really we're in all spaces at the same time, almost between our body and our psychological self. Architecture is defined, I would argue, by its generational spatial problems. Not so much the form or the decoration or the aesthetics of architecture, but really by its spatial problems. And simultaneity might be one of our great spatial questions. You see in the house on the left, or on the image on the left-hand side, this kind of pivot point in the house where the master bathroom is straight ahead of you, the bedroom is in front of you, library on the right with the courtyard behind. All of those different spaces are seen equally from that singular pivot point at the same time. This idea had a real effect on Carver Apartments, which was one of the first of a series of permanent supportive housing for formerly homeless individuals that we began to do with an organization, the Skid Row Housing Trust, where it was explored as an idea at a kind of different scale and more lodged in the city. This project is very proximate to the freeway. It's immediately adjacent to the 10 freeway with this kind of continuous ground plane because the highway is elevated at that point. The shape had a lot to do with acoustics. The highway is very, very loud. By shaping the building, it started to deflect and pull away from the sound source. But it's also for, I would say, the speed, intensity, and identity from the highway. The building almost seems to spin or pirouette as you move around it. There's 2 very different plans in the project. On the left-hand side, the ground floor plan, which borrows a lot of its geometric ambition from the Pittman Dowell house. The spaces are organized as a series of almost perspectival skewers through the project from one street to another to the alley, so that as you move around on that ground level, you're seeing through those semi-public spaces to the continuation of the city beyond. As you move up from the second floor above, the building is organized with a series of studio apartments in a kind of spiral shape, all facing an internal courtyard. The building is built in the way that we build almost everything in Los Angeles housing, 5 floors, maybe 4 to 5 floors of stick-built construction above 1 floor of concrete. What was interesting to me was that idea of the concrete on the ground floor, because it felt like it had some relationship to the highway and the underneath of the highway. And I kept having this fantasy that the building was in some ways connected to this larger idea of infrastructure. the ground level. You can see out through the building to the highway underneath it. Then internally, the courtyard, as you're looking down, has a series of steps which form an amphitheater. They become a kind of social heart in the building. But as you're looking up, you see the sky. It's open to the day, to the night, to the week. And the light reflects down along those fins, which help to create some sense of veil or a little bit of a sense of privacy as you move around the internal space. But they have to do more than that. In all of these projects, the economics are so difficult that every element, in my mind, has to have a kind of tripleness to it. It has to do three things. In this case, acts as a kind of visual screen. It has the structural hangers, so all of the balconies are hung off of the building. Then there's a methane problem on the site, so all of the methane vents go up through these shrouds, and all of the rain leaders from the roof come down through it. So they have this kind of integral piece of the overall functional aspect of the building. You can't take them away. The building would flood or blow up or something, fall down. There's a series of community spaces in the project, not all organized on one level, but spiraling up along with the building. Community kitchen and garden on the ground floor, that amphitheater I mentioned. At the top floor, there's this outdoor porch which looks to the city. Maybe one of the most important spaces is at that middle level on the right-hand side, which is the TV room and the laundry room. It's a place that people, even though it's not very kind of glamorous programmatically, it's the part of the building that everybody goes to almost every day. And I place that on the same level as the elevated 10 freeway, so that when you're in that space, you're seeing the people passing by, and more often than not, stopped in traffic right outside that window. But the important thing is the reverse of that equation, where the people, I think, on the highway who normally move by this community and leave it in a kind of anonymity, have the opportunity to look in and create a kind of connection, even for a moment. When I was doing the project, I mentioned I had this kind of fantasy of connecting two types of civic or city infrastructure, housing and the highway. And I mean, obviously the image starts to portend that. But that idea of infrastructural scale really stuck with me. Could housing be seen as an integral part of the infrastructure of the city in the same way that bridges and roads and waterways, electrical power lines are? Could it have that same kind of essential importance and also borrow some from that scale? Not long after, we began a project, it's called One Santa Fe, for the street it's on. You see the building in the background. The building is incredibly long, quarter of a mile long, 440 units of housing, 80% market rate, 20% affordable housing, about 80,000 square feet of retail space. And a building that's very much in contrast to the towers, as opposed to a kind of vertical form. It's obviously a horizontal form, defining the edge along the river and the rail tracks. Well, you get it. Yeah. But I think that idea in a city whose uniqueness is not a kind of identity that has the classical skyline, but in fact produces this expansive, sprawling mat of horizontality. There's a real question about how do you create identity within the city at that scale. The building becomes a kind of armature for relationships to the city around it over its entire length. 3rd Street comes in and ends at the ramp. The ramp that is a ramp to the elevated parking structures is almost like a infrastructural campanile. The building turns into a bridge spanning, creating a gateway that allows access to a future rail station behind the building. SciArc, Southern California Institute of Architecture, is on the right-hand side, also a quite long building because of the rail lines that used to populate the entire part of this district. The program is organized as maybe a Neapolitan sandwich of different program types. At the top, it's primarily housing, everything from single studios to 4-bedroom to living room spaces, which is almost the most affordable way to live here because you can live as a group of 8. In the mid-level, there's additional housing, but also 2 levels of above-grade parking that can be converted in the future to additional housing units. And at the ground floor, that 80,000 square feet of retail space. Even at the scale of a building a quarter of a mile long in a place like Los Angeles, the suburban model, especially of construction, persists. It still defines the way that we tend to build a project. So in this case, while there might be concrete up at the 3 floors, it still is a wood frame building for the most part, using and borrowing many of the same techniques and assembly line techniques that built the suburbs outside of Los Angeles, all around the country, Levittown certainly. The bridge of the building is important. As I mentioned, there's a future rail station coming in on the right-hand side. The building at this point starts to raise up and starts to layer over, almost like a palimpsest, different function with other elements of the project, whether it's commercial or some of the existing elements, something very prosaic like the parking lot. Parking lot is designed in a way that it can be cleared out regularly and becomes a kind of civic plaza for the building. I like this image because, as opposed going back to that idea of identity, as opposed to architecture that exists on picture postcards in the foreground or in the background as a kind of skyline, this building occupies maybe almost a middle ground in between those 2 worlds, where it becomes a part of the textures and the fabric of the city. Identifiable at times, you get glimpses of it, but just as often living in a little bit of anonymity with the rest of the incredibly heterogeneous textures of Los Angeles. Star Apartments is another project that we worked with the Skid Row Housing Trust on, maybe the most adventurous, ambitious of all of the projects that we had done with them. It was the 3rd of the projects that we worked with them. This one is from right around 2010, maybe actually a little bit later, maybe 2013, 2014. 104 units, all studios. This image shows how proximate Skid Row, which is where this building is located, is to the city as we think of it, downtown, the financial district, the place where most people go. It's where Disney Hall is, where the opera is, really the cultural heart, Museum of Contemporary Arts of the city is. They are just a few blocks away from each other, but they are literally existing in 2 completely different worlds. This project had a number of, as I mentioned, very ambitious ideas attached to it. One was to reuse an existing building on the ground floor. Second was to try to produce a type of almost hyperdensity in a city that is not known for its density. And for a number of reasons, to try to explore prefabricated modular housing for the project. There was this 1-story existing building that we largely kept. We stripped the facade, which is just a stucco facade, off of it. But all of the structure of the building we kept as the base of the new building. It allowed us to maintain the entitlements to use it as a commercial space, and to be able to reuse the deck of the building. And then we made a new tray, a new concrete tray that is, in a sense, almost feels like it's suspended above that building. And then the modular units are stuck or stacked on top of it, creating also this in-between space, this layer in the building. Density, this scale, with almost every part of the site built with this mat, 5-story mat of housing, might not be unusual in cities, and certainly isn't in a place like Tokyo, but is a completely foreign concept in Los Angeles, and really created this pressure not only in terms of how you might live there, but in terms of how you might build there. There was no staging space really for the building. And that's where prefabrication started to become very much an issue. As I mentioned, it wasn't something that had been done. It wasn't even allowed in Los Angeles from a code standpoint. Much of our work as architects was to create a pathway with the city, even before we started design, to figure out a way for the city to permit and entitle the project. Interestingly, because there's no real prefab in the city, all of the units were built in Boise, Idaho, and then trucked down. When they finally all got there, all of the units were stacked in under 3 weeks, which means that it was almost like an instant building. The interiors were completely finished. They were all tapped together. All the utilities were tapped together. And then we placed a new skin on it. That mid-level I mentioned is really the community space for the building. I think there are a number of ways that you can begin to form a room, a place. The traditional way might be a traditional interior space or almost a piazza with buildings wrapping around it to create that kind of urban room. But I was more interested in how you might be able to form that kind of space, not by creating pressure from the sides, but really from the bottom and the top, to create this layer that said something about both what was below it and what was above it. On that in-between layer, there are many of the community functions organized. There's community kitchen, community garden, where they grow a lot of things for the community kitchen and for their own kitchens. Vocational classrooms. There's a pickleball court in a quite tall part of the space. There's a jogging track, art classrooms. So it's almost like this amalgam of the types of civic spaces you might find in community neighborhood corners and parks in Los Angeles. Building is built in a very direct way. Again, almost like a piece of infrastructure. The economics of the building meant that it would be in many ways quite raw, but I think that muscularity is a real part of the character of the building, where you see the structure and the overlaps of those spaces. In some cases, with the stairway, this texture and the stacking of the fluorescent lights create almost a sense of a kind of spatial installation in the building. The top right-hand corner is where the pickleball court is now located, and that scale of space is also unusual in something like an affordable housing project, but really tries to be a kind of community civic or city hall as much as it is a perfunctory space. The project was a part of the 2018 Venice Biennale, where I had a room in the central pavilion. I was trying to represent the three scales of the building: the city, the community, and the individual. We made this very large wallpaper map, which you see in the background, where we drew every single building, including the buildings that we've done for the trust, into that map as a way of trying to create the scale of the city. We've had to now update that map like 5 times because the city continues to grow. Community was really represented by the very large scale model in the background, where you could get in and see a lot of those social spaces. But the models that were the most interesting, I think, were the models of the individuals. These 1 to 10 scale models, where we worked with the residents in the building, and about 25 people wanted to participate, 25 residents. And we as a group, we cataloged their entire apartment, everything in the apartment, down to pencils, paper, coffee cups, exactly as they had them. And then we worked really over the course of a number of months, like miniaturists in the office, recreating all of those elements. It was a way of starting to give significant agency to the individuals who lived there, but also show that even with a prefabricated module, there was a great diversity in the apartments and the way that people outfitted them, the way they brought things to the apartment, what they loved. And I think seeing them see their apartments represented with such a fine level of care was a very emotional moment for everybody who was involved in that part of the project. I think when we talk about transformations in the city, our expectations are often that transformation has to happen at a kind of transformational scale. You have to redevelop an entire neighborhood, a whole block, a huge building, a big civic center, a convention center. And of course, that does have a huge, almost gravitationally changing effect on a city. But I think there's a different way that we can also think about significant change in the city. And it's a more iterative, time-based idea where you begin to add a number of smaller increments. And this is a map of the different projects that we've done just in the downtown area with a lot of these Skid Row projects. As well as one Santa Fe, where over time they start to create maybe a network that taken together is as large a scale as any of those larger transformative projects, but happen in a way that also weaves the city and the grains and the textures and the life of the city together. That idea of connection is hugely important to me. We've certainly been exploring it in those ideas about individual buildings and their relationship to the city. But we were also able to explore the idea of true connection in a very realistic way across lines of division in a more literal way with the Sixth Street Viaduct that we finished in 2022, which crosses the LA River, connecting Boyle Heights with the downtown, and you can see it with the arches in the middle of the image. The fact for me was that the river was just one of the lines we were spanning. And in fact, I thought the old bridge, which had these two pairs of arches right at the river, celebrated the river, but in a way celebrated something that separated the two sides of the city, as opposed to the idea of a bridge as a more connective element. If you really burrow down into the analysis of the site, it's not just the river, though. There are all of these lines that are hugely a part of the city that the bridge needed to move across. Water and power main lines, 11 separate rail company lines. The Army Corps of Engineers controls the river. There are multiple underground utilities. There's 3 state and federal highways. And the bridge, in a sense, is a kind of civic skewer across all of those different elements. This is an image on the left of the original bridge and those arches over the river. Those arches also had another role in the city, and they were a kind of icon in the city. They celebrated the river crossing, but they were also celebrated in movies, TV shows, car commercials, Grease on the right-hand side with the bridge above it. I thought that what was important, as I mentioned, was to connect all of these pieces. And so I thought of taking that arched form and repeating it as a kind of connective ribbing, tying the bridge together from one side to another, but also maybe top to bottom, because the underneath of the bridge, because it's lifted above, is being developed right now. It'll open in about 6 months, a new 11-acre park for the community. The arches are at many different spans and heights. The roadway is one big curved arc and plan. The arches tilt outward to embrace the sky. All of those give the bridge this incredibly animated and alive quality, like it's really in movement. It's not a static or stable image, which I thought in a way was an icon for a city that is changing and is moving as much as a place like Los Angeles. It also means that no matter where you are, the bridge seems to have this slightly different appearance to it. It's not one image. It's this more cinematic, unspooling visual that you are in dialogue with as you move through the city. I mean, I think this is an interesting image also because it tells you the kind of context of this onslaught of other infrastructures and very gritty, not glamorous part of the city. I mentioned the underneath. It's just as important as an 11-acre park designed by Hargraves Jones. On this side of the park, there's another 1.5 acres on the other side of the river, which is a new performance plaza. The goal in the bridge was not to just connect the cars side to side, but bicycles, scooters, joggers, pedestrians, and to use the arches as these access ways with stairs and ramps spiraling up through them so that the bridge becomes kind of a animated urban playground in many ways. This is the park is in construction. This gives you some idea. This was a bit earlier. The railings aren't on the stairs up, but you can see how the ramp runs through it. There's at the base of each of those arches is a base isolator. It's a bit like a spring. We have earthquakes in Los Angeles. This is the longest base isolated structure in North America. So the entire bridge in an earthquake is able to move 3 feet in any direction to reduce the loads on the bridge. But really the bridge deck and those spaces, not just the park, are important because they become this kind of civic piazza or plaza. I think, in thinking about the bridge, one of the things that I was focused on was in a city of Los Angeles, like Los Angeles, which is a city of many different cultures, but separated from each other and divided often by infrastructure, by highways, by culture, by economics. Could you push an infrastructural project to try to do more, to try to be a kind of multicultural enabler, a place where many people come together, a place where some image of the city starts to be formed just really by the aggregation of all of those cultures in one place. Is it possible to not just connect different communities across the river, but be more a kind of center of community, in a sense, to make the dividing lines into a space, a place that is the city itself. There have been all sorts of, the bridge has been totally taken over, mostly by good things, sometimes not. But the really fantastic things are, like lowrider parades, and people are taking photographs of their cars out there all the time, stopping traffic. They just stop. There have been many wedding proposals, quinceañera parties, and graduation photographs. TV shows, of course, are out there all the time. But people have started to tattoo the bridge on things like their arm, and they've been sending us pictures over time of that, which is, I think, maybe the deepest level of commitment in the city. I'm going to pivot a little bit here to talk just about a few more projects that relate to this, not so much housing. But in 1992, there were the Rodney King uprisings and riots in Los Angeles following the Rodney King verdict. It was a really transformative time. I started the office in 1995, so it was right at this moment. Those uprisings completely transformed much of the way that I and many others saw the city. That kind of romantic idea of what Los Angeles was, the story that Los Angeles told to itself all the time, that it was a multicultural, integrated city of the future, was really turned on its head. And what you realized was a more troubling undercurrent. Underbelly to the city, where those lines that I mentioned before that segregated and separated the city became much clearer. And as the uprisings moved around the city and transgressed those lines, it became absolutely clear that our conception of the city had been totally turned on its head. A few years later, we were asked, right after I started the office, to make a project for an organization called Inner City Arts, which is a nonprofit arts organization that teaches art in Skid Row for some of the most at-risk school children in the Unified School District. ICA was largely started by a group of individuals, teachers, philanthropists, community activists, as a kind of cultural response to the uprisings. It was really intended in its design to be a different version of a city, one where these different groups could in fact come together to work together on these cultural projects, on education. It started as really not so much a cultural center, but this ambition to be a center of culture, a kind of hub of culture and community connection in this part of the city. We've worked on a number of other cultural projects in LA that share those same ambitions: the Hammer Museum, Art Center College of Design, the Goethe Institute. They've all taken a great deal of personal inspiration for myself from Inner City Arts and a lot of the thinking that went into that early project. But I want to talk about a few other projects, not in Los Angeles, very different cities, but I think that relate. We recently completed a museum in Winnipeg, in Canada, in Manitoba, called Kalmayuk, which is a part of the Winnipeg Art Gallery. It houses the largest collection of post-war Inuit art. It's a complicated site in the middle between a series of buildings that are really a part of this troubling history. The Hudson Bay Company, which was a trading company and one of the first to go into Inuit communities and trade with them and bring back the art, forms a kind of complex neighbor history to this building. But up along the length of Memorial Boulevard, the upper left, is the provincial headquarters, and that whole history with provincial governments for the Inuit community is very fraught. You can see the provincial headquarters at the end of this boulevard. The existing Winnipeg Art Gallery that we were adding to was a building built in the late 1960s, 1969, by an architect, Gus DeRosa from Canada. Very beautiful building, triangular form, really sculptural, but also incredibly insular, very internal, as a lot of buildings from that period were. It is a sort of fortress for the art inside. The ambition for this, for Kalmayuk, was in many ways in contrast to that. But it started with a number of trips to the north to meet with the artists, the elders in that community, and to begin to get a sense of the context at the Arctic Circle where the artists live and, more importantly, practice. It has this incredibly vast scale, and the work that they make is completely contextualized in its materials, forms, its meanings by that place. There was a real question: how can architecture begin to make connections across these cultures and places, especially when it really exists in the abstraction and the scale of a place represented in the images? The museum had a long relationship with the artists in the communities of the North. This project, though, grew those infrastructures and relationships to include the Artists Council, Elders Council, the artists themselves, like Elicipi. Ishulatak, who is in the kind of periwinkle top, silver hairs, one of the most important Inuit artists working. We spent, as I mentioned, quite a bit of time there, but it was really in these group conversations, not just seeing the site in the landscape, that we began to, I think, embed a number of the ideas that were most impactful for the design. It was a challenge to add to the building. We made many iterations of the model to try to get at a form that both worked with the building, but also worked with a lot of the ambitions of the Inuit artists and their directors. One of the things they mentioned was that the building could not really, they didn't want any rectangular boxes, no orthogonal corners if possible. The building should feel as fluid as possible to relate more to a lot of the historical context as opposed to the contemporary built situation that they find themselves in. The building also had to have its own identity, even if it was joined to the Winnipeg Art Gallery. So in a way, they were both, the existing building, the new building were meant to be two separate objects, but almost that acted as one object in conversation. The building is made out of granite bricks. It was another one of the considerations. The artists had asked that the building really be made out of stone, much like the sculptures they make are made out of granite and stone. Building feels like it almost floats off the landscape. It has a kind of scalloped form, which certainly communicates a bit of that fluidity, but it's really trying to capture the light of the place. The light in the north, but also the light in Winnipeg is very beautiful, changes significantly. It almost seems to embed itself in the material as it moves across those facades. The building and the light interact in a way that it changes significantly over the course of the day. The bricks are laid in a kind of wave pattern that slides across the facade, and again gives another kind of scale to the facade over the course of the day. At the street level, the building lifts up, very transparent, so that the inner portion of at least the public spaces can be seen whether you're coming into the museum or not. The majority of the collection is in what's called the visible vault. It's that glass structure vitrine in the lobby. It's unusual for a museum to be able to show a collection so transparently for conservation reasons, but because the art tends to be almost all made out of stone, that's changing more now as the artists take on more contemporary materials. But it is able to resist the light. It can be really in more transparent setting. And one of my goals was to see if we could move the collection out of the basement so that, again, even if you were just walking by or you're coming into the lobby, you would get a sense of the entire collection, which is in that more fluid wave form. It has 3 levels in it. The conservators and the curators work in that space. So not only are you, as you move around and up, seeing the work along the perimeter, you're seeing the museum at work at the same time. You're seeing the conservators and the curators working inside that space. I mentioned that kind of fluidity of the space, and for me, that really relates to this idea, I think, that very often the art looks the best in spaces that are proximate to the kind of studio in which it was made. The abstract expressionists look amazing in these kind of loft-like spaces. 19th century European painting often needs the kind of chair rails and the cornices to situate it. Abstract or maybe geometric art in the kind of white cube. Here, the studio is the vastness of the north, and you can't replicate that, but maybe you can insinuate those qualities in the forms and in the sense of light in the space. We just are finishing a project at Rochester Institute of Technology. I haven't really talked about this in a lecture yet. It opens April 10th. The existing campus is a campus that was moved to the suburbs in the 1970s. It's called the Brick City because everything, all the buildings are made out of brick. It was developed collaboratively by let's say a 70s architectural super team, Roach and Dinkaloo, Harry Weiss, Ed Barnes, Hugh Stubbins. Dan Kiley did all of the landscape. They all agreed that the forms would change a bit, but everything was going to be made out of this one common brick. The building walls, the floors, in many cases the ceilings are all made out of brick. The campus has expanded over time, though, and our building is at another end of the existing campus, where it's really a threshold between the campus and the outside where all the parking is. It's a 750-seat full proscenium music hall, and has, because of its two-sidedness, two very distinct edges. The plan of the theater is at that center. It is a kind of horseshoe-shaped theater. It almost feels like it rotates as a form between the inside and the outside of the campus. What's maybe most consequential is all of the normal back of house functions aren't hidden away in the building, but are organized along the perimeter of the building with glass facades so that you can see between what's going on inside the building, the costume shop, the set shop, the rehearsal spaces, as you move around the building. It has intense systems. I won't get into those inside the building, but I think even in this axonometric, this technical axonometric, you can see that kind of rotation of the auditorium on its hat. There are a lot of things here. One of the things I want to point out is the kind of color key, because color here was really used as a sort of material. And I think this video, you'll get maybe not so much a sense, you will in some of the other photographs. Obviously a very different context in Miami. But it really sits along that edge and becomes this entry point along, especially that curved street into the campus. And then from the campus moving back out, you start to see that building and how the rotation of that box comes and registers with the lower plinth. The facade is an aluminum panelized facade made out of a series of extruded tubes. Those tubes relate to a number of things. One of them is this historic organ inside the building. As it turns into from day to night, the interior starts to become much more visible, and these colors on the inside of the facade start to become that much more visible. Again, these photographs are from before it's been fully occupied. That whole lower level is where those back of house spaces start to really be seen as you move around. Just some of the details. The lobby on the inside is not a set of stairs that you confront when you move in, but because of that twisting in the form, even the stairs start to put you on that movement up and around the space. Light fixtures are used in ways that, in this case, are almost like chandeliers attached to the column. Some of the walkway spaces up above, in many cases, they get quite tall. They become this layer between the outside world and the theater world. And I think that idea of being in these spaces where you begin to almost be in an in-between before the performance starts, but you're leaving the reality of the world that you just came from. are very important in theater spaces. These are some other details of color, the light fixtures, and the way that they start to define edges and spaces and gateways and thresholds in different ways. And then the theater is not completely complete here, but it really is this combination of almost Broadway theater formed using a wood veneer, but then a kind of black box at the same time for the experimentation that's going to eventually take place here. I want to finish with a project here in Miami that I think is addressing many of the issues I've been talking about tonight, and is the reason I want to end with this project. It's an incredibly exciting project for me. Kathy Leff, who's here, who's the executive director. We've been working together, and her team and her board over the last number of years to develop a kind of a new future for Bakehouse. It's been around, many of you probably know, for 40 years, started by artists who were evicted from studios in the Coconut Grove area, came together, purchased the abandoned Flowers Bakery building and converted it into Bakehouse. It's grown over the years. I think its presence in the community is absolutely essential in the artistic community, but just as important in the community that surrounds it in Wynwood Norte area. It's now supporting over 100 artists a year, and if you take that back over 40 years, you can imagine how many artists have been touched by, in a deeply consequential way, the work of Bakehouse. It gives you a sense of the site along the 95 freeway, really an area that in Wynwood that's mostly smaller scale residential, but is under a lot of pressure, clearly, as the city develops. There is this continuing growth of cultural institutions in Miami. That's extraordinary, and Bakehouse is very much a part of it. But there's also more complex story that Bakehouse is trying to lead, to be a leader in dealing with, and that's the question of affordability and access for, in this case, especially artists, often young artists. But it's also really a question about sustainability in the city as a whole. This is a map currently of income levels, median income levels. Red is less than $30,000. That's the most challenging. Economics, as you move to darker blue and purple, the economics, of course, get up well over, as a median income, $160,000, $200,000. You can see that kind of pressure is only going to continue to increase as the movement of that blue and purple starts to, let's say, move from right to left and continues to push up against Bakehouse. The project is incredibly ambitious. It has a number of different important parts to it. It's bounded, as I mentioned, by the 95 freeway. I think I can do this. The 95 freeway along this edge, 32nd Street, which has a school across the street from it, 33rd Street, really single-family residential houses, and then Fifth Avenue along this other edge, where you can really begin to see the development happening. Bakehouse exists in these 4 existing old bakery buildings that have been its home over the years. Those buildings stay, but we're replanning the interior to work better, to be more efficient, to add more space. The yellow portion along 33 that then begins to snake out to the existing entry of 32nd is space that will have expanded studios, potential almost storefront space at times for artists to be able to use. It's also in the form that moves towards the entry, a kind of shaded community portico that could have a community accessible library and cafe that's usable not just by patrons and artists at Bakehouse, but really by the community as a whole. What I think is so important is at the center, there's a garden, and these two edges don't wall the community off, but they're passageways through on both sides so that the community is able to really use that space. This is really intended to be also a deeply useful and accessible community amenity. There is a new garden at the center, which is accessed by everybody. And then maybe one of the most forward-thinking parts of the project is 65 units of affordable housing for artists on this edge forming the campus. It faces the freeway or overlooks the freeway, has these incredible views past it. But also, I think it's interesting that it becomes a kind of, let's say, billboard or facade for people as they're driving by who are going to ask the question, who lives there? And the answers can be a community of artists in Miami. We're looking at continuing to develop opportunities. There's a site that Bakehouse has purchased recently, and we're examining that as a part of the overall master plan to grow affordable housing, 95 units potentially in addition to the ones that we're planning. So this becomes really a consequential number of units for affordable artist housing. The blue is just a test massing. This is a county site that Bakehouse is in conversation with the county about how that space really works the best for the community as a whole. Bakehouse certainly. That site looks like it would be designated for housing. We think up to about 230 units could be built there with ground floor retail. This just gives you a little bit of an accent metric of those forms and how they begin to work together, but and also the scale of the neighborhood. The entry from 32nd Street is met with this big porch canopy that swoops out from the center of the campus to greet visitors and acts really not just like a welcoming porch into the campus, but really a porch back out to the street. I've had these experiences after events at Bakehouse where everybody pours out and kind of hangs out in this space where they're waiting to be picked up or their Uber ride. It's also this kind of place where the city and the community of Bakehouse meet in a more informal way. I think that's only going to continue as Bakehouse grows. We're creating these landscape elements, stepped amphitheater where people can hang out. Maybe performances could happen really on the street. There are these two great grain silos that have been left from the original bakery. And here we're starting to mimic that in the elevator that accesses the affordable housing in the rear of the view. From 33rd Street and the neighborhood, scale is very important. The housing is larger, but these studio spaces start to reduce in scale. They become a porch in and of themselves, a lively place for artists in the studios to spill out onto that porch, having conversations with the neighbors around, a place for the neighbors to hang out, artists to hang out, for really to create an edge of connection. The folded sky roof of this new form, and even the folded form of on the housing, starts to recall some of the folded skylights of the original Bakehouse building. There are a series of pathways that move through and across these outdoor spaces, mostly shaded, but of course some in the garden, all in an attempt to find ways to create places where people can pause, interact, create that campus community. The plan really begins to be figured by these long linear elements, almost as if a kind of landscape structure comes into the building, and landscape and interior space are more intertwined. They're not so isolated one from the other. This is the entry off of 32nd Street into that garden, the new hallways through the existing bakehouse, the housing on the upper side, and the studios off of 33rd Street. I like this diagram that we've been looking at, the figure ground. Of course, this is very much an architect's drawing, but where you start to reverse the form and the spaces, and you get a sense of how important these interlocking lines, these long arcs and fluid threads through the building are to the overall character and connection within the campus, but also to the community outside of it. Those hallways are really meant to be these very active spaces between different types of studio space. It's not a double-loaded corridor where you walk by and doors on either side and you don't really see what's going on, can't see anybody in the distance. We're using it almost as in the way that a kind of picturesque landscape or garden is made, where you're constantly your farther view, what's happening beyond, is in your perspective. So you begin to put together an unfolding view of the activity in Bakehouse. I want to finish this image. I was talking about this again a little bit earlier today as well, that I mentioned when I started to talk about Bakehouse how excited I am because it uses many of the elements, it touches on many of the elements that I think are, well, certainly important to our work, but I think are deeply important to the idea of the city and of community and of the sustainability of community. Bakehouse is really going at that like a kind of torpedo, like a laser beam with this project. The arc of many growing cities, the cities we admire because they're really growing and they're dynamic, is that there are places in the beginning where they create lots of freedom to do things. There are lots of places that you can find in the periphery to be an artist and to have a studio and to make something. But over time, as the city grows and becomes more and more successful and wealthier, it often begins to move into those spaces, take them over, and edge that kind of creative community out of the equation. It adds larger cultural spaces where people can see things that are made, but the opportunity to preserve and make and grow places where things are made becomes much more challenging. I think the healthiest cities are not one or the other. The healthiest cities are the ones, the sustainable cities, are cities that are great cities to see things in, but they're great cities to make things in as well. In the case of Bakehouse, certainly a place for artists to make their work and connect that to a community of people who are interested and collect that work, who come to see that work, but also a place where you can make true community happen, a place where you can create and weave together an idea of the city, maybe again a kind of microcosm of the city, maybe even a more perfect vision or perfect version of the city. I don't think it's asking too much, especially for architects, to make that an ambition for our projects, to make architecture perform in such a way that it really becomes the kind of catalyst and eventually the armature for producing that more beautiful vision of what a city can be. And we're excited to be part of that here in Miami. I'll stop there. I appreciate being invited. Thank you very much.
Thank you for Amazing lecture. Great work indeed. A lot of us using part of the validate this impulse we had about bringing back one of the speakers for more. So thank you for that. You mentioned how affordability is really one of the big challenges we have, and certainly some of your projects are actually best known for tackling this issue. You see actually perhaps a trend to shift from the main preoccupations in the field from the environmental questions, the social, and therefore to the questions of affordability and access. Is that like a general trend?
I think in many ways, certainly for a number of years, the questions around environmental issues, sustainability, climate resilience, those have been very much at the forefront. I don't think those issues are going away in any way, but I do think that there is a growing awareness and concern from a social standpoint about things like affordability, because they are also elements around the sustainable cities, around those cities. So I don't see them as being mutually exclusive. I see them as being reinforcing. But I also do believe that much of this is being driven by realities that a generation, for instance, students who are getting out of school, trying to live in cities, young families trying to live in cities, are grappling that affordability and access to something as simple as the idea and the reality of housing is the differentiator between being able to exist and live in cities or having to find some, move back into the suburbs or move farther and farther away from these places. So I think it's absolutely the most pressing issue in almost all of the large, certainly coastal cities, but there are many cities where this is happening. You would not have imagined this question before.
You're right about how they go hand in hand. For instance, here in Miami, of course, ground zero climate change impacts resilience is a big question, but I think affordable housing is important now has become more so. And I think this parallels when we speak about this. But what just like with sustainability, especially on the there's also a sense of moral imperative, almost like a call for austerity, right? When we talk about housing, affordable housing, there's this expectation that maybe we should relinquish, the more the formal intricacy or exuberance, because it has to be affordable. But I think that's so refreshing and encouraging about your work is that we don't capitulate. Right? Can you?
No, I completely agree. In fact, I mean, we try to go exactly at that. Many of those preconceptions of these projects. Of course, you have to be mindful of the budgets that you have, and you're often walking a bit of a knife edge around a lot of challenges. But I think it's one of the places where architecture thrives in those types of challenges. I think it's too easy an equation to say affordable housing, the budgets aren't so good, so we can't do any of that. And so it has to look crappy and we just have to do it as expediently as possible. We dealt with those same budgets that the crappy buildings were built with. And I think we've accomplished something else. And I think we've accomplished something else because because of the capacity for architecture in all of its capabilities, all of its disciplinary thinking, its critical thinking, its invention around problems, you're able to move through to produce something that is of some significant quality. And I think that's important for a couple of things. I just want to touch on that. One, when we first started to do some of that work, I heard criticism from people saying, why are you trying so hard? Why are you making these things, those communities? You could just build housing and it would be fine. And it used to really piss me off. It was really, I thought, made me really angry because, of course, one, that says something about the seeming disposability of the people who live inside of the buildings, which that was outrageous. But secondly, I thought it was so self-defeating. We all live in this city together. You know, in a sense, we're all living in the aquarium together. And why would you pollute it with, why would you want to live in a city where you could make a great contribution, add to the overall vibrancy and quality of the city? Why would you do something less good when you didn't have to? And it's had an effect even on the people who live in the building. There's documented sense of significant pride for people who haven't really had that kind of position, visibility, visibility in the city. They haven't seen in the city to also have a building where they can say, I live there. That's a real tool of architecture. And it's also one of those places where there's been a lot of pushback around things like signature architecture over the last number of years. I understand this, why that's happening. But I also think we have to be careful of architects that we don't throw out one of our greatest tools, and that is the ability to make something that looks like something. Because when we started this sleeper work, one of the things that the trust asked us to do was to make a building that looked like something, because they wanted to point to it and say, we're not going to shy it, we're not going to shy from the problem. We can make something of quality that's a real contributor, and that it's visible in the community as a whole. And that capability of communicating through the aesthetics of what we make is a tool we shouldn't easily let go of.
So another expectation that comes with the affordable housing is that when there's innovation, usually it lies in an ingenious funding mechanism or the intrinsic logic of the building in terms of units, geometry, and things like that. It's always about what I think in the previous conversation you called them internal aspects rather than in relation to the city. And I think your projects are strongest in the way they rethink housing in relation to the city.
I mean, that came a lot from the very first project we did was this project called Rainbow Apartments for the Housing Trust, and they were just starting to invent this model of supportive housing that people kind of apartment there, no matter what their income is, a sliding scale of income. They could live there permanently. They started to build community, and that supportive services were brought into the project. It had a new kind of complexity to it. One of the first things we realized in talking to a lot of these were formerly homeless individuals, was that they were chronically homeless, which meant they had to have been out on the street for over 10 years, which if I find homeless was like 6 months, but gives you an idea of the scope of the problem. Because of that, they would build these psychological shells around themselves and be very isolated. They couldn't exist in any kind of communal way. The way we tried to deal with that in the architecture was we took the double-loaded corridor, which was the typical model of apartment buildings, corridor in the middle of apartments on both sides. which was a problem because people would go up the elevator, they'd go down the corridor, they'd go into their apartment, just disappear. Crack that open so that the building was organized to U-shape with a single loaded corridor, outdoor terrace, non-conditioned, so we didn't have to pay for mechanical ventilation. HVAC was much less expensive. But it also meant that if somebody moved up through the building, they didn't just disappear. They actually, you saw them move around, and they saw you in the corner. That simple change in the, let's say, the spatial idea of the building had huge ramifications. Why that was such a lesson for me was we were also trying to build the building in the run-up to the 2008 recession when the economy was going crazy. It was way overheated and building costs were just every day going up. And the type of construction contract, let's get some weeds, but the type of construction contract that the trust had signed was this cost plus contract, which meant the contractor would buy studs and they would, whatever the price of the studs were, they'd pass it on to the market. Well, the cost of all the stuff was going through the ceiling. We had to start pulling all of the stuff out of the building. You know, we had these window shades around the windows to protect it from the sun. They were meant to be painted red around the whole surface. We couldn't afford to paint both sides. We could only paint one side. We reduced so much glass in the building to create more transparency. It was really a loss. We were having a conversation where they were actually considering just going to 2 screws and the hinges and a door as opposed to 3 screws to save some money on screws. When we finished the project, I was really a bit distraught because I thought we had participated in a building where we had pulled so many of the things that I normally thought of as architecture out, that it was going to be a tough place to live. But then the building thrived. And I realized it thrived because a lot of those ideas about the way that the community could get built, the kinds of spaces that you still made, the connection between inside and outside from the city into the building, were really active. They really had an effect on the life inside the building. And it made me realize that architecture had this huge role, not only in kind of technical metric inventions in the building, but it had a real role in how it helped to continue to foster, sustain, and propel genuine community.
By the way, this idea of architecture as a project of city making its resonates with this whole system modular here. For instance, the first studio freshman year fall is the project at the scale of the city. They start with the city and then it's counterintuitive, you know, you go from the city to the building. So, but still, I think there is still a prejudice built into this pedagogy. However, you know, really amazing, insightful. There is this notion that still the versus housing is still meant to be more backdrop. That's not where the public life is. That's it's the relationships you're talking about happen in what would be the wide area and the knowledge land, right? So we don't think of this thing as that stage where those very interesting relationships can be actually constructed. This is another way architecture actually goes against the meaning of certain expectations.
I think some of that is this ongoing and pervasive pathological hangover that we've had around really the way we build much in North America, kind of suburbanization of the idea of housing, which led to ideas about, in many cases, the ideas of zoning. Those had the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, early part of the 20th century, things like zoning, and all sorts of reasons. I mean, they had some really progressive reasons as well, trying to move manufacturing away from where people live to induce it or to support a healthier lifestyle. But really got used, I would say, in more often sinister ways to separate and isolate different groups and communities by economics and by race, by ethnicity, and that was exaggerated by the complicated history of a progressive program around building government-sponsored housing, where a lot of those projects, which had a great idea to build a lot of housing for people who needed it and to build it often reasonably well, were also at the same time pushed to the peripheries of cities without any kind of supporting. They were really far away from your jobs. There were grocery stores. You couldn't get to transportation. They were really segregated and isolated. So you had 5,000 housing units and you didn't have a grocery store you could go to, or you didn't have transit that you could get on to go and get that job. And they became, they failed. And we all know those stories. And so I think this idea that housing in some ways is segregated in our life, almost because of a kind of zoning hangover, is really something we need to fight in schools and in architecture as a whole. I think we have to advocate for complexity, not singularity. And that sounds abstract, but I think it's actually the core of how you begin to rethink the role of housing in the city and begin to tie those pieces together. For instance, can you literally take other what might seem like incompatible uses and integrate it into housing? Can you take a community gymnasium and place it in the center of a housing building? Can you take actually in Starbucks, it's the whole ground floor of the county health department has put a kind of retail clinic there. It serves both the building and the community that surrounds it. It becomes a real destination. Not really the role of housing to have that there, or the housing to have that there, but it's all ways of trying to make a more complex building. I ran a studio at Berkeley recently, and that was really the idea. It was about housing, but it was really about bring these other like farmers market into the middle. It's on the third floor of housing. It's ridiculous, but why don't we start to try to experiment in architecture schools as opposed to only refining our capability to move those metrics, right? To be good professionally in the way that we build housing, very important, absolutely important. Maybe we can use the schools to experiment and invent more around how housing can be the catalyst for a different large incredibility.
Well, I hope so, because we are really now moving into that phase of collective fruitful preoccupation with housing. I hope that it's going to be about that kind of complexity. So let's open it to questions.
And thank you for the panel.
I can speak without that, but just
because there are people online, so we need to
try.
Did you push the
Just reset it. Might turn on. Really great. Up and down. Grab it. Yeah. You want to use one? Thanks, Red. Okay, thanks for waiting. Thank you for coming and giving us an excellent lecture. I think Miami is so often situated in between kind of urban metropolis of New York and more suburban metropolis of Los Angeles. And if Miami were to ask New York spatially what it needs, New York might say things like, well, you need more congestion, you need more brownstones, you need more wedding cake zoning. What do you think if Los Angeles had to give advice to Miami? What kind of advice would you
I love that idea that these cities are like calling each other, having Zoom calls and throwing out on them. It's a very interesting question because I think embedded in that question is this question of are all cities, is there an ideal version of a city? And do we study that idealized version of the city and replicate it? And for me, I think the answer is no. That cities are, of course, there are certain mechanisms and certain continuities between different ideas of what makes a city work. But I think it's a mistake to try to import models that don't necessarily resonate with the city you're in. I mean, because there's climatic changes, there's cultural changes, there's environmental differences, there's scale differences. It's one of the things I've been fascinated about Los Angeles. I think for better or worse, one of its great export economies, it's version of urbanism, and you see it in these new contemporary cities around the world. In Asia, maybe starting to exist a bit more. The African continent, India. So the lessons, I think, in a place like Los Angeles would be a mistake to ask New York what it should become, because actually what we're doing is what's starting to occur in Mumbai, and what's happening in New York doesn't necessarily make any sense there. One, I think it's important to really look at the history of the city that you're in and to try to dive and excavate very deeply into the cultures and the layering of those cultures. We talked about that in one of the studios I visited today, to try to extricate things which are more resonant, maybe more present in the cities that we're in. And then maybe it's looking in different directions. I've advocated for a long time in Los Angeles that we shouldn't be looking to Europe for our models. We should be looking to Central and South America, partially because those cultures have often found ways to live between inside and outside because of the climate, but also because of the culture, that are much more useful than we might have in trying to make New York work in LA. I've been hugely influenced, really interested in the landscape architect, Brazilian landscape architect Rhode for years, because he was able to slide in his work between these scales of doing a house, doing a garden, doing a park, doing a civic landscape, doing landscapes inside civic buildings, government buildings. That, I think, is really interesting, the kind of fluidity in the way that he approached this idea of the civic, of the public, and the environment, literally the physical environment in a place like that. That's, I think, there are much more interesting lessons to be had in those places. So I think it's more important maybe to be critical of the traditional lessons that we have in architecture, and to maybe look in less called over places.
Thank you. Does anyone?
And yet, all of your projects do placemaking. They do focus on the combination of forms and spaces, the spaces in between and the mixing of activities. It's really interesting. And so when would you not want a 15-minute city where humans have the ability to function and form physical connection by being local, hyper-local, repeated daily patterns? You know, where would the 15-minute city not be relevant? Form is one discussion, use is another discussion, ecology and environmental translation another discussion. But when would you not want a 15-minute city?
You know, I don't think it has to. Again, I think my 15-minute city is that it often, I think, ends up being that kind of either or. And I'm not sure that it has to be. Absolutely, the idea that you can have a precinct that incorporates almost everything somebody might need on a daily basis, that forms a linked community, that becomes a kind of place, is absolutely, I think those are really essential places. And you're right, we've tried to do that in a lot of our work and some of our planning. But I also think we have to be careful in a place like, for instance, Los Angeles, I know, where that 15-minute city, the idea of these distinct, let's say, neighborhood centers, has also worked in parallel with the history that's produced a lot of segregation, a lot of separation, a lot of division. Because the city has been able, there have been wealthy neighborhoods and enclaves have been able to, in many ways, siloize themselves from other cities. So I think it can be an extremely good thing. But again, as I was saying, with a lot of the projects we're doing, it's not enough to look at maybe a precinct in isolation, but to more look at it in terms of its effect in relationships across the entire city, entire metropolis. I think in a city like LA, those hubs, those precincts are important, but just as importantly, it's the linkages between those communities that start to break down barriers. Just give you a quick example. I've been in this compound. I can't seem to make it work, but for a long time, the Unified School District was trying to build new schools. And the communities, these kind of local communities where they were trying to build new schools, didn't want them. It used to be that schools, everybody wanted the school in the center of their community, but communities now think of schools as being problematic and they attract all sorts of problems. And so the communities didn't want them in the center of the community. They were trying to push them out to the periphery of their precinct. I thought, well, that's interesting. Maybe that's a good idea. And maybe you could have the schools in each of those precincts continuing to push their schools out, but then eventually they would meet at the dividing line. And then the school would be a kind of bridge between these two communities so that you have spaces like the gymnasium, the library, maybe shared spaces linking two communities as opposed to really being on the edge. I think there's ways to invent in those problems.
Do we have any other questions?
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a question about your design process from your studio. Your work generates very interesting geometric and organic forms, with intersections and collisions. That evoke emotion was mine, so I applaud that. How do you discipline your studio or restrain yourself? Where do you start and stop that experiment in form, in shape, and space?
When the client says you're done. Not really. we don't we don't ever really start in the same place. Well, I guess I would start by saying, for me, the process of design really starts. It can start almost anywhere. It starts maybe an observation on the site or something somebody said or a bit of an image. Just looking for a way into the project, just that kind of finger hold into the project. Because as soon as we get that, then it's generally off to the races. The process starts to develop in and of itself. It is a very iterative process, and we try not to restrain ourselves, at least in those early phases. We're trying to explore as intensely as possible as many different ideas as we can to test what feels right. Once in a while, we get lucky and you really hit it very quickly, but just as often, we're trying a number of different things before an idea starts to form. And often it forms not, it doesn't get born fully formed in and of itself. It comes from these kind of collisions between a bunch of other ideas that we tried on. Right. So I feel like those attempts and failures are absolutely essential. We have to move through those. So we try, when a new person comes to the office, talk about that with them, that it isn't about getting it right the first time. In fact, we asked everybody to just try to forget about getting it right. I think that's hard, especially for students coming out of school where they want to get it right. They want to be successful in everything they first do. Out of that, then I think the project, we work a lot in physical three-dimensional model. We jump scale a lot. And so it allows you to continue to fill in, let's say, fill in the blanks, fill in the detail, fill in the scales that you're interested in to see what the relationships are programmatic to the context around it. At some point, I think you know that you've gotten the project to where it needs to be, but that's not a conversation you have when you do have it with the client, you have it with the city, you have it with the community. You're taking all of that feedback, and at some point, the project is answering enough of those questions that you can be more convinced it's going to be successful.
I had a thought about the work that may answer this question also. I noted that this is a pattern how you always want particular form to do more. You want to get more out of something. This is the arches. The bridge have to do more. They're not just structural or iconic, but they also have to perform like ramps. Instead, there's always the forms, those intricate geometries perform in different ways. The fins, the internal courtyard are conduits. They reflect the light. There's always this multiplicity of functions that will give a reason for being for all of these moments.
I think that's absolutely right. It touches on any number of responsibilities that architecture has. It certainly has economic, pragmatic responsibilities that begins to touch on. But I also think at the far end of the equation, architecture exists for a very long time. And we come back to it over and over and over again. And I think a lot of that kind of multiplicity is working to give a building, a space, a landscape, the right amount of density, almost density of experience and way of engaging, that somebody can come back in a month, in a year, and see something new and ask a new question of the project and connect to it in a new way that continues to make real connections with an individual, that makes the projects more likely, makes them live. It's the difference, for instance, we do quite a bit of exhibition design. It's part of our work that I really love. It happens super fast, working with a museum to do an installation of the artist or collection, and we have, I don't know, 3 months to do the design, a couple of months for installation. It's fun. It's like a shot of adrenaline, but it doesn't have the same responsibility. The things don't, the project doesn't have to stand for, doesn't have to have that same density or multiplicity of ratings. It can just be one thing. And if you were to come back to that exhibition 3 years down the line, I think you'd see through it. Its thinness of ideas, its ability to carry density of experience and ideas wouldn't have been formed fully enough. So, that's a bit of an intuitive threshold that you have to get to, maybe an experience threshold that I feel like you get to over time. But that's where I'm trying.
Thank you. Thank you very much.